ride on is IdeaPaint. Unfortunately, he has to run to the airport fairly soon, so this is going to be a little bit of a shorter fireside chat. But you know, the story behind IdeaPaint was started actually in a dorm that I lived in Babson College called the E-Tower, and you can probably talk more about it. But the initial idea was when, you know, the concept behind E-Tower, it's a dorm where people kind of want to start businesses while they're in school. And a lot of times, you know, before you want to start a business, you need to have a great idea. And these are, you know, 18 to 22-year-olds living in school, have different ideas come to them at random times of the day, and they didn't want to forget anything. So first thing they did is, as they moved into the dorm, is they started putting these sheets of paper on the wall so they can write on these sheets of paper. And John goes, well, why isn't there a freaking paint that you can just paint on the wall and start writing on it? And that's where the idea for IdeaPaint came around. As you can imagine, as with any business, there's been a lot of challenges starting something like this. There's a lot of, you know, product issues and stuff. And the IdeaPaint is a real story of struggle, hustle, and then, you know, ultimate success. But it wasn't easy, I would say. So please welcome Jeff.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
Your office is sick. I get to visit a ton of offices around the world, whether it's like Salesforce, Nike, Google, Autodesk, Facebook, you know, the list goes on, but nobody else has this view. This is awesome.
Yeah. Could you tell me more about like, the early days of IdeaPaint, how the idea came around, and you know, basically how maybe like some of the very beginnings of the company? Like, I know for a while you guys had problems with the product, so
Yeah.
so problem, but yeah, it wasn't the easiest product to create.
It really wasn't. So as Alex mentioned, my buddy John came up for the idea for IdeaPaint when we were freshmen in college. And the initial idea came about pretty much through brainstorming other business ideas on a wall in the E-Tower where Alex lived. And there was a frustration in the fact that nobody could like really work together all that well. They were brainstorming on a whiteboard. If you think about it, a whiteboard literally puts a constraint around your creative thought process. You're literally framing it in. You have to erase old ideas to make room for new ones, and you have to, you know, it's basically, you know, very limiting. You can only fit one, maybe two people at a whiteboard. So when John and one of the other guys started taping up giant sheets of paper all over the wall, everybody stood up and became actively engaged in the meeting. It was much more dynamic, much more fluid, much more, you know, much greater interaction. And that's what really ended up kicking off the idea for IdeaPaint, and it kind of flows into some of the stuff that we worked on early on in the company. So I joined the team, or I joined John shortly after we graduated from Babson, and one of the biggest challenges that we had at the time was, first and foremost, how do we get a product? Because at that point he had worked with two different labs while we were in school, and both labs had said IdeaPaint was impossible to develop. We kind of had this tagline back in the day, it's like, you can land a man on the moon, we're just trying to make it paint you can wipe markers off of. This thing has to be possible. And we set off to create the product, and it was a real roller coaster for the next like year and a half, 2 years, until we launched it in June of 2008. And you know, we were kind of going down all these different chemistry paths, and they would occasionally max out. You would effectively be back to square one, just knowing that that path no longer worked. And one of the toughest things that we had to deal with was keeping our investors on board throughout the process. We had 4 different angel investors in total, all of them associated with Babson. And you know, they were basically funding us to get to a certain stage gate for proof of concept. And the chemists were constantly coming back and saying, we didn't get proof of concept. So one of the things that was challenging for us in the early days was we had, you know, the 4 years where John was at Babson, and then the year and a half or so after college where we were working on the idea, and all of that compounds to, you know, 5 to 6 years of product development and no product. So it was kind of a struggle in the early days just to kind of keep with the concept, but we always had this idea that IdeaPaint was a whole lot more than just paint. And I think that's kind of what kept us going, is everybody that we talked to, they were like, yeah, of course that stuff should be created. Like, totally makes sense to write on our walls. Like, why wouldn't that make sense? And it started to feel like this post-it note type of idea, or is such a simplistic product that everybody, you know, kind of conceptually understood right away and said, yes, I would love that idea. I think one of the, we finally got the product in June of 2008 and launched it in a very big way at a trade show. But one of the early decisions that mattered the most for us as a company was really how we built the brand. And we had some people surrounding the company that kept telling us, hey, you guys should just put it in a can for like $20 or $30, or double whatever your cost is on the stuff, and put it on the shelf at Home Depot, Target, or Walmart, and just start to blow it out through the retail channel. And for us, that was the biggest mistake we could ever make, because that was kind of really going low market, and it wasn't building a long-term sustainable brand and business that we thought we could build and leverage IdeaPaint for. So IdeaPaint for us was kind of like our Trojan horse into creating a brand that stood for collaboration, creative thought, innovative thinking, and really put us in a leadership position in terms of an influencer in office space design. So early on, when we were working on the brand, it was very important for us to work with influencers in the market that stood for office space design and could teach us how to design Google's office space or Nike's office space and things like that. So we launched the company in June of 2008 at the largest architecture and interior design trade show in the world. And we pretty much ignored every other market. So for the first 3 years of IdeaPaint, 2 to 3 years of IdeaPaint, we did nothing but travel around the world and work with the leading architecture and design firms on the most marquee projects they were working on. It was very cool because we got to sit in the room with the people that were designing Microsoft's new offices, or Facebook's, or Google's, or Victoria's Secret's, or there are a number of our early customers. And the point of doing all of that was to put us, to build our brand in that space design market and make ourselves kind of an influencer in that area. And we always thought that if we did that correctly, we could eventually really go to the mass market in a true B2B fashion, have a brand established, and eventually bring more product lines into the business.
Awesome. Now tell me more about the Victoria's Secret.
Victoria's Secret was actually our first large customer. I was telling the story yesterday at Autodesk. We had gotten a meeting there through one of our advisors that consults for Victoria's Secret, and we had no sales materials, nothing at the time. And we walk in, and the offices are spectacular in every way, not to be ignored the fact that they have giant 100-foot images of Heidi Klum on the walls and so forth. And we were dreaming of them designing their clothing on IdeaPaint, so putting us throughout all their design centers. And we walk in, and they were all psyched up about using us in their training rooms. And we were like, well, that's the most boring use you can think of. And but they actually put us in these giant training rooms that were 80 feet by 80 feet long with huge ceilings, and they'd have 50 people in there, and they had a projector on the ceiling, and they painted all the walls with IdeaPaint. So when they were training, they would do 2-day trainings and swivel the projector and take notes on IdeaPaint next to it. So after about a day, they would be talking about a topic and relate back to the notes that were written over here. And after a full 2 days, the entire room was just covered with the entire training session. And it gave us actually a lot of really cool information and cool methods of use that we brought to schools and other training centers around the country. And then they started using us in the design centers, and they did one it was the smallest order ever, but they started painting mannequins and then designing the clothing on mannequins, which was really kind of cool. We had one in our office for a while. It was ridiculous during parties.
One of my questions is, I know in the early days, there's a story that, and tell me if it's true or not, I wasn't there during the time, but John, when he came up with the idea initially, a year later, he painted walls in E-Tower with this paint, and I was like, wow, IdeaPaint came out a year later, and then we found out, sometime later on, that it was toxic.
So this
happens.
Yeah, this was great. I wasn't involved in the company at this point. John and I were just good friends, and I heard about this because they had one of the first steps in development of IdeaPaint was basically, why don't we get a bunch of chemicals from paint stores and auto body shops and other things that could, have similar properties to what might work for our chemistry. And the way they were figuring it out was basically taking dry erase markers and writing on anything. So like you write on a car, it's actually dry erasable. So anyways, they just basically threw together a concoction of stuff, painted it all over the walls. It's like, smelled terrible, but stuff actually worked great. And it was kind of cool because I remember hearing about it around campus. Like, I remember going up and trying it. I remember hearing professors talking about it in class. Professors were coming up and saying, man, I want this all over my classrooms. Babson still uses chalkboards, which is ridiculous. But the professors were saying, we want this all over their classrooms, and then they were also going out and they do a lot of consulting on the side. And it's like, can I drive customers into IdeaPaint? I have a bunch of initial customers for the company and so forth. And so John goes out to try and make the stuff, and it was indeed very toxic. So it took shouldn't have been in a college setting whatsoever. You weren't supposed to paint your walls regardless, let alone with whatever was in this mix. So that the interesting kind of anecdote though that comes out of that mindset, which I think is great, is that was not something that was okay to do. It was potentially dangerous for everybody in the room. However, one of the most important things in startups, regardless of if you're number 1 or number 500 at a company, is just creating action and getting out there and making shit happen. And the fact that they did that was really great because initially it got great proof of concept. So people could actually internalize what the product looked like, felt like, how they would use it. Professors could go out and say, man, if I had this wall in my classroom, it would help enhance the way that I taught. If I had this wall in my conference room or painted the entire office in it, it would enhance the way we created and collaborated. And it's kind of cool that even though that was not necessarily the best thing to do, it gave a great initial proof of concept to the product in general.
Could you tell me, I know in the very early stages, as you mentioned kind of in the beginning of your story, IdeaPaint was not an easy idea. It was an easy product, somebody would have already kind of came out and mass marketed, and you guys kept going to these labs, kept burning investor cash. So tell me more about why didn't investors back out, and how did it keep you, what kept you guys going? Because you were young, out of school. I'm sure a lot of people were doubting that this would work, and you kind of it was 3 of you at the time, right? You guys were not even chemists, and so so tell me more about how you guys basically decided to keep going, and 2 with investors, as you kind of went to lab 1 and it failed, lab 2 and it failed, and then finally worked out. How did that process go? I mean, people told you it was an impossible thing to do. People who knew a lot more about chemistry than you guys.
Yeah. So the while the product was being worked on at Babs, and John was told by 2 different chemists it was effectively impossible to develop. And I think they weren't, the quality of those potential partners, I think you could debate a little bit, but either way, they're great people that knew a lot about chemistry. And I think, it's kind of that adage of nothing's impossible. Again, the party line back in the day was, you can land a man on the moon, we're just trying to make paint you can wipe markers off of. That's clearly possible to do. I think what kept everybody going, and specifically our investors, is people get attracted to energy and momentum. And if you're creating energy and momentum around the idea and the concept, it's fairly intoxicating. We kept, as we were doing the development after I joined the team, John and I were going out and we talked to the 4 different angel investors, but then more so we were out in the market talking to potential customers, talking to people about how they would use it, and really building out the business plans. And as you started to uncover all these different pockets of potential, just like you guys have found over the years, it's different ways that people would use it, different challenges that the paint and dry erase board category had, today, the overall size of the market. There were all these different anecdotes that just started to add up to an overwhelming story. And I think that was pretty important in keeping people kind of invested and, more importantly, engaged mentally in the business. because as we were encountering, challenges with the product development, the investors were seeing a building story where the company just made more and more sense if we're able to ever get the product. And at the same time, I think people don't necessarily just invest in ideas; they invest in people. And developing those relationships with the investors and keeping them, up to date, but more importantly, treating them as partners, I think was a key part to keeping them involved in the business too.
Awesome. And you guys have Paul Fireman as one of your investors, right?
Yeah, so he is, Paul is the chairman of Fireman Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm that invested in us. So we
Started Reebok, right?
yeah, he's the founder and former CEO of Reebok. And our lead investor is the former chief marketing officer of Reebok, Dennis Baldwin. So he founded Breakaway Ventures and then clearly has very close ties to Paul. And I had been during my first business. I was a commercial lobsterman out of Massachusetts, and I actually still do it on the side for fun on the side of IdeaPaint. My brother and I had built the lobstering business up to about 500 traps in high school, and we were catching 400 to 800 lobsters a day. And we kind of rolled the cash flow from that business into a number of other projects. One was lobster and clam bake catering. The other was real estate. We bought an apartment building, converted it to condos. But then my father had consulted for Reebok, and we became athletic apparel distributors for Reebok and distributed athletic apparel into winter sports teams because nobody had created like an Under Armour for ski racing yet. And we were both ski racers, so it was really easy for us. We just plugged it into like teams all of our friends were on. And as a result, we ended up getting involved with Dennis, who was the CMO of Reebok and my father had worked with in the past. And Dennis became kind of a early advisor to myself during college and then later at IdeaPaint to IdeaPaint, and ended up investing in us. And the first meeting when John and I were pitching Dennis, he had Paul in the room as well, and both of them have just been outrageous supporters of IdeaPaint since the beginning, still to this day. And I think one of the things that I think we did quite right is you hear horror stories about some VCs and then amazing stories about others, and I think with investors it's very important to pick people that you can see aligning with the vision that you have for the company. And we really wanted to create a long-term sustainable brand and really invest in brand and marketing and not just treat it as a paint. And the mindset that Dennis and the rest of the Reebok team had, or Dennis and Paul and so forth, they created one of the largest, most internationally known brands. I mean, Nike might have beat them in the long term, but still you go to any country around the world, people know Reebok. And they had that mindset of, man, this could be a giant mass market brand someday. Let's jump on board and make this happen. You could tell they weren't strictly financial investors that were looking for a quick return in a year or two. They really were passionate about creating the company long term. And we're now, let's see, it would be about 6.5 years into Dennis's first investment. And as recently as last week, he's reiterating how passionate he is about the company and like what's our 3-year plan to grow it.
What tell me more about like once you guys come out on the market in 2008 to today, like what maybe some of the growth, but more importantly, like some of the challenges you faced that you might have not foreseen. I'm sure there were many.
I think the biggest thing we made one big mistake in the early days, and that was we signed a exclusivity agreement with a distribution partner that was way too long. It was the right decision to do if the agreement was a little bit shorter. It was a company that had a 100-person sales team that marketed to the architecture and design market across the entire US. And so they gave us instant access for a team of 3 of us effectively right before we launched. They gave us a 100-person sales team that knew the architecture and design firms in every major metro across the U.S. And they were willing to make us their flagship product, willing to invest very significantly in marketing dollars to promote it. They were willing to give us unprecedented access to their sales team so we could treat them like an extension of our team and really walk into all these initial major customers. And we also, thank God, gave them sales minimums that they had to hit over the life of the contract. And great deal to sign in the early days, but what it ended up doing was they had an exclusivity to basically the commercial office market, the commercial new construction renovation market. And while it was really good for creating some real great initial excitement in the company and give us scale immediately, once we hit kind of year 3, the contract really didn't make sense for us anymore. The brand had outgrown their ability to service it, and what was happening was a company like, say, Microsoft would use us in one regional office, and Microsoft has 500 buildings across the US, 500 offices. And they would call us up and say, hey, we want to use IdeaPaint throughout more of our offices, but because the sale had come in through that distributor, we weren't allowed to touch it, and we weren't allowed to go expand Microsoft. And the distributor was really only set up to work with the architecture and design community and wasn't really good at penetrating a large enterprise account like a team should be set up to do. And so we were finding a lot of these opportunities just went, unfulfilled. We were doing a lot of great customer acquisition and finding a lot of great projects, but our long-term customer management was falling real short, so there wasn't much repeat business there for us. So it actually was looking back on the company, it was one of the biggest fundamental mistakes we made in the early days that impeded our growth. And just this year, we remedied it. So on April 1st of this year, we walked away from that distributor, which at the time was almost 40% of our overall revenue. And it was a massive risk because 40% of your revenue, that was huge. And that also represented a solid portion of our profit. And we ended up now investing in our own sales team, took kind of a giant risk, and we're ending this year having beaten our sales plans and ahead on cash, and now have a really metrics-based sales model that we can totally control. So I think back to your initial question, about challenges that we faced, one of the challenges that we faced was we couldn't control the customer, and we quickly realized how important that was for our growth long term.
Cool. This will be the final question. Unfortunately, Jeff has to fly back to Boston. He kind of did this in a fairly short notice, but what kind of, if you had a piece of advice or one of the maybe lessons that you can share that you learned, what could you share with the team here?
I think the one piece of advice that I always have for anybody in the startup world is, action trumps everything. So it's just get out there and make stuff happen, because everybody that's involved in this world is exceptionally smart. You can always figure stuff out, you're aggressive and scrappy and so forth, and you have to have trust in yourself to put yourself out there, take a risk, start creating action, and then know that things aren't going to go perfect. You're going to succeed and fail, and startups are built out of a series of successes and failures. But if you don't create that initial action, you're going to get nowhere. The quickest way to failure is an action. And I have seen so many different startups or people that are in the startup world just plan themselves into failure, because you can plan forever. And I think the biggest thing that we've done right and wrong at times, but more so right recently, is just start getting out there and creating waves, learning from them, and adjusting quickly.
Awesome. A little present for you.
Sweet.
From Virool.
Thank you.
Are you shaking hands in?
Yeah.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, because I have a ski bag.
Okay, awesome.